so it's clear that 9/11 caused Muslim terrorism to be more of a concern than ever before. That was the cue for various media pundits to ask the question anew, just where are the moderate Muslims condemning terrorism? Yet, despite all the questioning, Muslim condemnations came thick and fast. So here's a collection of statements on the 9/11 attacks compiled by Charles Kurzman, a specialist in Middle East and Islamic studies from the University of North Carolina. The collection includes various condemnations from Muslim scholars, intellectuals, community organizations, and also the Organization of Islamic Conference, the representative body of Muslim nations. By the way, I've put links in the description for online sources, so do check them out if you want to read more. So here's another page linking to a statement signed by various academics, both Muslim and non-Muslim, this time the work of Omid Safi, Professor of Asian and Middle East Studies at Duke University. American Muslims are good neighbors, devoted to their families and to following God's commands to do good works. There are now some 8 million Muslims in the United States, and mosques are to be found in most every major city. The overwhelming majority are peace-loving human beings who share the shock and despair of all Americans. They know that terrorist acts in the name of Islam are a perversion of their most sacred beliefs, and the actions of a few should not characterize the whole. So now we return to the historical leadership of the Islamic group and the initiative to stop the violence. In 2002, they published 4 manifestos aimed at refuting extremist ideology under the title Silsilat Tashil Mafahim, or Correcting Misunderstandings. These texts were sent to Al-Azhar University, the leading Sunni Islamic center of learning, for review by the Council of Islamic Research, who corrected minor mistakes and gave their approval. The historical leaders based their critique on the Sharia principle of maslahah, or underlying objectives of Islamic law, in addition to fiqh al-waqi', or contextual Islamic jurisprudence. In essence, their view is that if any ruling of Islamic law is implemented but does not serve the underlying objective for which it was established, then the implementation of the rule must be reassessed. This reassessment will be made in light of the current context. In other words, fighting against the Egyptian state was seen to damage the image of Islam, whilst also serving the interests of America, Israel, and other nations, with the enabling of anti-Islam propaganda. As a result, they believe that fighting should be deemed Islamically prohibited. On the 7th of July 2005, a series of coordinated suicide attacks in London killed 56 and injured hundreds. In response, hundreds of Muslim scholars and imams condemned the attacks and issued a fatwa, stating, "Islam strictly, strongly, and severely condemns the use of violence and the destruction of innocent lives. There is neither place nor justification in Islam for extremism, fanaticism, or terrorism. Suicide bombings, which killed and injured innocent people in London, are haram, vehemently prohibited in Islam, and those who committed these barbaric acts in London are criminals, not martyrs." In the same month, a conference was convened in Amman, Jordan, in which 200 of the world's leading Muslim scholars issued a unanimous ruling seeking to curb sectarianism, forbid takfir, or accusations of apostasy, and emphasize that it was only Muslim scholars who had the right to issue fatwas, contrary to the attitudes of many extremists. So here's a quote. "On religious and moral grounds, we denounce the contemporary concept of terrorism that is associated with wrongful practices, whatever their source and form may be. Such acts are represented by aggression against human life in an oppressive form that transgresses the rulings of God, frightening those who are secure, violating peaceful civilians, finishing off the wounded, and killing prisoners. And they employ unethical means, such as destroying buildings and ransacking cities." Then a verse from the Quran, "Do not kill the soul that God has made sacrosanct, save for justice." We condemn these practices and believe that resisting oppression and confirming justice should be a legitimate undertaking through legitimate means. We call on the people to take the necessary steps to achieve the strength and steadfastness for building identity and preserving rights. Later in August, Muslim scholar Afifi al-Akiti published Defending the Transgressed, a detailed fatwa against targeting civilians. The fatwa is forwarded by Lebanese scholar Gibril Haddad, who branded terror advocates as deviant and lauded the fatwa for its, quote, clarity of thought and expression, together with breadth of knowledge of Islamic law. The fatwa is a response to the now infamous al-Muhajirun, a group in the UK which claimed that Muslims were allowed to conduct attacks against Western countries in retaliation for casualties in Afghanistan, Iraq and elsewhere. Al-Akiti rejects this view, using his knowledge of the Shafi'i school, one of the four main legal schools of Islamic jurisprudence. There is no khilaf or difference that all of the Shafi'i fuqaha or legal scholars of today and other Sunni specialists in the sacred law from the Far East to the Middle East reject outright the above opinion and consider it not only an anomaly and very weak, but also completely wrong and a misguided innovation. The amal or action cannot at all be adopted by any mukallaf or layperson. In 2007, the Washington Post covered fatwas against terrorism issued by Ali Jum'ua, former Grand Mufti of Egypt, and the influential Shia scholar Muhammad Husayn Fadlullah, covering suicide bombings in particular and condemning sectarianism among Muslims. You're probably seeing a trend here, but there's still more to come. In February 2008, an anti-terrorism convention was held in India by Darul Deoband, one of the main centers of Islamic learning in South Asia. The conference was attended by roughly 10,000 Muslim scholars from different groups, all collectively stating, Islam is a religion of mercy for all humanity. Islam sternly condemns all kinds of oppression, violence and terrorism. It has regarded oppression, mischief, rioting and murder among severest sins and crimes. Later in November, you had the Hyderabad Declaration, organized by the Jamia Ulema Hind, where 6,000 scholars said the same thing. In 2009, Nidal Hassan killed 13 and injured 32 at the Fort Hood military post in Texas. In response, he was widely condemned by Muslims in North America. An example would be Faraz Rabbani of Seekers Hub, a Canadian group of Muslim scholars. In his statement at the time, Rabbani listed 6 reasons as to why the shootings were un-Islamic. These were betrayal of the Ahad or Covenant, referring to Malik's being an American citizen, impermissible deceit, killing those not actively engaged in combat, doing something without clear sanction, and doing something of manifest greater harm for Muslims. In 2010, Tahir al-Qadri published his now famous Fatwa on Terrorism and Suicide Bombings, an extensive text of almost 500 pages, replete with references to Quranic verses, hadiths of the Prophet, and historical Muslim scholars. In summary, Qadri states that killing and torturing civilians is prohibited, and that Muslims should seek change through non-violent political action. He also organized a press conference in London, where he briefly summarized the book. Qadri also noted that the media tends to focus on terrorists and extremism to the exclusion of Muslim condemnations.
My dear and respected audience and the journalists and the leaders of the community, I would say a wrong image has been presented about Islam in the Western world. The reason is that media is always interested in news. And peaceful people never create news. This is the first time I would congratulate you that a declaration of peace has created a news. Throughout the history, media is always looking for news, and a terrorist creates news which peaceful person cannot do. So that's why they were always being propagated and promoted. And the picture which Western world got about Islam and Islamic Ummah and community, that was because of the terrorist people and the people shouting here on the roads and saying we will hit America and we will hit Britain and we will do this and that, the silly people. So these were the news which have been always promoted, and they are very few people, but they are armed. Single armed person is powerful than 100 unarmed persons.
In the same year, the Global Center for Renewal and Guidance organized a conference in Mardin, Turkey, in which it highlighted the misuse of a historical fatwa issued by the 14th century Muslim scholar Ibn Taymiyya. This was led by Abdullah bin Bayyah, arguably the foremost Muslim scholar today. So here's a quote from the statement. "Security measures, no matter how fair and just they may happen to be, cannot take the place of an eloquent, scholarly elucidation supported by proof and evidence. Therefore, it is the responsibility of the Ummah's religious scholars to condemn all forms of violent attempts to change or violent protest within or outside Muslim societies." It's also worth referring to Yahya Michot, a Belgian scholar and specialist on Ibn Taymiyya, who disagrees with the emphasis placed on the Mardin fatwa by these scholars, though he does agree that it has been misunderstood and cannot be used as a resource to justify terrorism. Michot authored Muslims Under Non-Muslim Rule, a book on the treatment of non-Muslims according to the writings of Ibn Taymiyya, in which he wrote, quote, "Any wolf eager to pounce on Mardin will certainly have been disappointed." Al-Shabab. It's an al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, and easily the most dangerous terrorist group in the country. In 2013, 165 Somali scholars condemned Al-Shabab during the country's National Conference on Extremism. So an obvious trend is being identified here. Not too much scholastic agreement with al-Qaeda or terrorism. Writing in his book The Rise and Fall of al-Qaeda in 2011, Middle East expert Fawaz Gerges expressed the optimistic view that al-Qaeda had failed to win the approval of Muslims at large, and noted the role that Muslim scholars had played in facilitating this. So in his words, bin Laden's transnational jihad and tactics have been delegitimized from within the world of Islam, discredited and undermined by prominent religious scholars and clerics and former cohorts who jumped ship. Far from gaining traction, Muslims did not jump on bin Laden and Zawahiri's bandwagon because they view it as aimless and pointless, devoid of a clear roadmap. Writing in his book The Far Enemy, Gerges makes it clear that the media and Western policymakers largely dropped the ball when it came to recognizing this. As he put it, bin Laden and his transnationalist cohorts have lost the war of ideas, the struggle for Muslim minds. That was a critical achievement overlooked by American commentators and policymakers who turned their attention to al-Qaeda and like-minded militants and overlooked the fault lines among jihadis and the vast societal opposition to global jihad. Had they tuned in closely to the internal struggles roiling Muslim lands, they would have had second thoughts about the military expansion of the so-called war on terror and would have realized that al-Qaeda is a tiny fringe organization with no viable entrenched constituency. Had they listened carefully to the multiple critiques of al-Qaeda by Muslim scholars and opinion makers, they would have had answers to their often asked question, where are the Muslim moderates? Had they observed the words and deeds of former jihadis and Islamists, they would have known that the jihadi movement has been torn apart, and that al-Qaeda does not speak for or represent religious nationalists or Muslim public opinion. However, whilst al-Qaeda may have been on the decline, extremists would capitalize on the instability in Iraq and later Syria in order to usurp their own territory and claim a caliphate, bringing us to part 3 and the problem of ISIS. If you like this video, then please check out my Patreon page where, for $1, you can help to make future videos possible. Ideally, I'd like to work on this channel full time, so any support would be appreciated. Please click the bell to get notified about new videos, and also to like and subscribe. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.